Thank you. It's been very impressive to listen to such an incredible accumulation of ambition in a single site, and that is in itself, I think, a huge compliment for the Qatar Foundation. Qatar is the only country that kind of officially encourages you to think. And in that sense, my experience in Qatar and confrontation with Qatar actually made me think, and was a very important impact in the last maybe decade of our architecture production. I think that, and we've heard a lot of emphasis this morning about traditional kind of Islamic patterns, traditional Islamic issues. I think that you would almost forget that Qatar is also a kind of very experimental condition that is trying to really define a completely new concept of culture and a completely new concept of the future. I think where we are all indoctrinated, certainly in the West and certainly in Europe, to consider all these domains that are in these different islands as kind of separate and autonomous, and where we kind of rarely, for instance, would think of combining art and sport or combining religion and media. I think the great thing of Qatar is that they are working on a new conception of culture where all of these are present in a seamless effort of lifting not only its own population toward a degree of modernity, but clearly also to define a new Arabic or maybe Islamic modernity for the country as a whole. And I think the last presentation showed that on the scale of a building, but I think you could look at Qatar at the scale, doing the same thing at the scale of an entire society, and that the ambition is something which is really unique in the world today. We had heard also the word globalization a number of times. And I think the interesting thing in Qatar is that, of course, partly because there were so few Qataris to begin with, Qatar has always mobilized intelligence from abroad to work on this project. And of course, when the project started, maybe kind of in the 70s or late 60s, Europeans were not particularly popular in the non-European world. The world was decolonizing, and particularly in the Arab world, I think the combined European effort was not particularly impressive. And we still kind of sensed the consequences of that. And so therefore, if you talk about globalization and context, it is ironic but also very interesting that part of the context of Qatar is defined by Japanese architects, particularly from the movement metabolism, which in the 50s and 60s kind of promoted and projected a very optimistic idea about a non-European future and an architecture that could escape from the norms and perhaps dogmas of the European and Western world. Qatar means kind of working in a master plan of Kenzo Tange, which was of course not entirely executed, but there's still kind of some remnants of it. And it meant kind of working in an atmosphere and a condition which is partly defined by Arata Isozaki. And because of my own interest in the non-Western architecture, I happen to be kind of confronted with this Japanese episode in the Middle East long before I kind of worked here as an architect. So this picture has already been shown, and this is the National Library by Isozaki, which initially was kind of planned here on the Corniche. and which was part of a project that remained unrealized. And even though I'm now doing the National Library, I would say it would have been great if Isozaki had been able to build this building. However, Isozaki did the master plan, as we heard this morning, for Education City. So here, particularly, his presence is very strong, and it is kind of based on the axis between the conference center and the kind of ceremonial square here. And our buildings are projected here on the one hand to the left of this axis, and on the other hand to the right of the axis, sandwiching a building by Isozaki himself. So to some extent, what we are doing is kind of really as much a kind of building is in Qatar as it is a building that kind of relates, or buildings that relate to the work of another architect. And therefore, it's kind of deeply aware that Qatar is a patchwork of different kind of modernities and different influences on globalization, of which the kind of European one is, in a way, perhaps the least noticeable. Here you see Isozaki's access, and here you see the kind of realization of this master plan in a kind of situation which initially, of course, was kind of very pure and still more or less desert. Here we work again, Isozaki's building, Isozaki's access, his conference center, and then the headquarters for the Qatar Foundation, which I will show you, and the National Library. One thing that has been deeply impressive for me, kind of from the very beginning, is how serious Qatar was. I worked a lot in Dubai, I worked a lot in the Middle East, but there is a unique atmosphere in Qatar of seriousness, and that enabled us to kind of really respond to a current, what I see as a current, maybe not a crisis in architecture, but a current issue in architecture, where all the kind of work of important architects may in themselves be kind of impressive buildings, but if you can put them together, there is kind of really a crisis of coexistence. And that would be, for me, the last thing that would be useful to do here. So what working in Qatar enabled us to do is kind of to benefit from that seriousness and to address serious issues. Here you see the headquarters. It is basically a kind of simple building, which is a kind of a part of office buildings, part of a management building, and then a kind of roof or upper part, which is kind of dedicated partly to the leadership of the Qatar Foundation directly, and where Sheikha Moza has her own accommodation. So it's three elements that are kind of wrapped together. And what is important to say also is that the kind of space between them is not air conditioned, but is actually kind of open. And here you see the configuration with the kind of part on it. I lived in an Islamic country as a child, so I'm deeply kind of immersed in Islamic aesthetics, and for that reason I find it difficult as a Western architect to emulate those aesthetics, but nevertheless we found it important that our building also has at least a relationship with it. So therefore there is a kind of gridded wrapper built around the entire building that kind of consolidates and turns a single entity out of these three separate elements, and that kind of defines their skin. You see here the kind of access, the building is standing on a kind of platform of a garden on top of a parking garage, and here you see the kind of access, car access to the kind of private parts of the building. Now the building kind of stands there, and for me it is a kind of important building also to realize that we've seen all kinds of faculty buildings, so those are not kind of really they're really public buildings, and the office building of the Qatar Foundation is, of course, not really an office building, not really a public building, but actually an office building. So therefore, its scale is less grandiose. And I think also its spaces need to be kind of functional spaces. The relationships need to be functional. There's relatively little symbolism. And the point of the whole building is to be a working space. Here you see it going on. Here you see the kind of current iteration at night. And you see also the way in which the kind of architecture of the building promotes or refers to ornamentation without necessarily adopting the kind of classical ornamentation of the Middle East. This is a work by a Chinese artist, kind of which says the word sensibility, and therefore it's again not a kind of Arab aesthetic, but it's kind of globalization producing a relationship with the Arab world. The building consists of a number of offices, obviously, and also auditoriums, kind of spaces for meetings and lobbies. And there's another kind of ornamental, the symbol of the Qatar Foundation is a tree, and therefore in some of the aluminum cladding there is a kind of pattern of trees which is actually quite discreet and almost invisible, but also at least a kind of reference to the mission of the building. You see the kind of typical situation because of the configuration of the building is that you never feel enclosed in one part of the building, but you always can refer and look at other parts of the building. And as you begin to see in these kind of relatively interior and private interiors, you also become aware that kind of in almost every image there is a kind of awareness or a presence of the kind of larger atrium space between the buildings. And perhaps the nature, here we are in Shaka Mosa's kind of apartment, and again that kind of skin and atrium space is present. And then perhaps the atrium space itself is the key of the entire building, because it's a very functional space, but because the grid is ubiquitous, and because the kind of surfaces of the architecture are kind of reflective, it becomes incredibly kind of rich and complex kind of series of kind of realities and reflections, all in one kind of single image. And this is exactly what I tried to do from the very beginning. I wanted to do a building that is responsible to its context, to a master plan that actually fits, and that looks at first sight simple, but that is kind of hiding all its complexities, all its ambiguities, and all its richness in the interior, where I think it should reside kind of perhaps in this world. So in an image like this, you actually don't even, you are even not able to determine what is kind of real, what is reflection, what is direct sight, what is daylight, and what is artificial light. And I think that in our work we've kind of rarely achieved kind of similar intensity, for which I'm obviously kind of very grateful. There's one interesting point in the building where there's a transition between the lower and upper part, where the building simply stops and is open, and that gives anyone kind of working there, but all the visitors also, a kind of very strong expression and ability to see the incredible achievement on all sides of Education City, and in that sense it's a kind of very deliberate effort to make a viewing platform. As I said, basically we did two buildings. Izuzaki's building is in between, so we're sandwiching another architect. And the second building we did is the first, it was intended as the campus library. but halfway through it was decided to make it a national library, and I think that is part of Qatar's seriousness also, that it seemed redundant and not wise to actually build two kind of competing and large libraries. But I think it also kind of really shows, and what I kind of really hope will happen eventually to Education City, that kind of maybe it can become more of a city, and that kind of maybe not all or every building is dedicated to one or another kind of university, but that there is also the beginning of a kind of urban life also for other citizens of the city. This is something, a diagram that we made kind of for the Seto library, which kind of simply shows the explosion of walls that the typical kind of library has today. As I said, Izuzaki's wonderful kind of building was transported here and in a building that has a kind of footprint about 140 by 140 square, an enormous space. And what I think what is interesting about the building is that it looks relatively small from the outside and kind of big from the inside. In the beginning, we wanted to make a building that kind of is inspired on an open book. And here you see, you know, the kind of initial version. It basically had an entrance on one side, kind of public area, and then kind of every single book was organized on kind of terraces on either side. So that, and this is part of the discussions we had with the Qatar Foundation and kind of with the librarians, that it is very crucial to introduce the notion of a library, the notion of reading, the pleasure of reading, but also the urgency of reading in this population. And that for that reason, to me, it seemed kind of undesirable to make a building in floors, but to try to do a library where its entire contents are visible in one go and immediately accessible to everybody. So that we would not have to have a kind of complicated circulation system. So here you see those terraces and that kind of presence of the book as the defining element of the entire library and of the entire architecture also. Here you have the earlier version, but in the end, and this is again a compliment I want to make to the Qatar Foundation, that they are incredibly critical and sometimes confrontational, and are able to really say that when they like or don't like things, and the simplistic nature of that open book was basically rejected. And that was very good for me because it enabled us to do kind of something perhaps more complex and more interesting. We took a plate, we folded the plate as initially, you know, with one single terrace, but then we created two triangular terraces, so that instead of simply kind of two parallel planes, we got a kind of more interesting and complex shape. And I think that enabled us, as you will see later, a much more interesting kind of entrance procedure. But what I think is the unique part of the building, or the original part of the building, is that we took exactly the same shape and made the roof out of that shape and kind of put it on top of the real library. So that there is a kind of real library in the lower part and a virtual library on the upper part. And that basically kind of these parts only touch in single points, as you see here. What the kind of great advantage of this new configuration was, first of all, that the building, of course, looks slightly less monolithic, but also that basically on the corners it enabled points where you could access, and kind of points where simply because the thermal mass of the white concrete, the places would be also kind of much less hot than the immediate environment. So here we see the notion of the building, the main entrance here, and as I will show later, the entrance to a special historical environment in the other corner. The real beauty for me, and this was something that I always was obsessed with as an architect, always wanted to make a building where the main entrance is in the center, so that you don't have this boring perimeter, an entrance, and then a transition to the core or essence of the building. So here you see there's a kind of ramp, and that ramp kind of projects you immediately to the center in such a way that kind of from the center, as you're surrounded by amphitheaters, and on those amphitheaters, every department is organized, and in a kind of almost panoptical situation, you can immediately understand what the departments are, what the nature of the books are, and how the entire entity works. Halfway through the kind of project, it became essential to also absorb or accommodate a very famous Islamic book collection, and basically we did that by excavating the central part, almost as a kind of archaeology, so that there is a kind of historical element that kind of really enriches or the kind of center of the building. So here we see the current, it's not entirely finished yet, we see the current situation. We see, and this is very important, we've seen today kind of buildings that are almost avoiding glass and that are basically kind of based on masts and walls. For a library that did not seem kind of desirable, so we had to find a way to, in the Middle East, to think of a building that also had large facades of glass, and we did that basically by curving the glass so that it becomes self-supporting, but also giving a silk screen print to it so that it acts almost like steel and not with this kind of unpleasant, dusty glass quality that disfigures a lot of architecture in the Middle East. And also it acquired by that a kind of real three-dimensional quality and beauty. So here we see all the ingredients, the kind of ancient collection, the terraces with books, and then a kind of single bridge that connects all the parts, and that also has a kind of a small amphitheater that connects again each of the elements, and that acts as a kind of meeting room, performance space. And as you can tell, given the scale, this entire central triangle is seen by us as a kind of public space, of course dedicated to the library, but of a scale where almost any other event can happen there as well. So, as I said, it's not entirely finished, so I will kind of show you some of the kind of images, the bridge, one of these terraces, the collection, ancient collection, and kind of basically the windows. What you begin to see here is that the ceiling, and the ceiling is of course the counterpart of the same shape as the library itself, is shiny, and that shininess kind of works for me in a very important way, because this is the line of the window, and it kind of means that it kind of pulls all the light into the center of the building in a way that even if there's no artificial light, every part of the library is kind of perfectly, kind of gives you readable light. And also the kind of reflection, of course, emphasizes the kind of irony that there is a kind of real building and a kind of virtual building overhead that meets it. Here you see again kind of some of the effects of the kind of shiny ceiling. The terrace, which contains book, is kind of reflected in a kind of floating and therefore kind of very light architecture. The scale of the building, kind of strangely monumental, almost of a kind of Roman scale on the inside, and relatively modest when you look at it in the outside. Here you see kind of systematically all the conditions of the building, the reflection, the terrace, the ancient kind of books, kind of seen from the bridge. So although it is essentially kind of a flat building, there is still enough and sufficient layers to take every kind of subtle to have different vantage points, and also to kind of experience the different relationships between all the elements. Here now you're standing on the ground. The old ancient library is kind of sunken as archaeology. You see the kind of bridge, but you also see how the kind of roof enables you, or enables the light to really penetrate to the core of a kind of really, really deep building. Some of the terraces in within the foreground. Of course, the building is also kind of very gray or light or colorless, because the books themselves kind of will offer color, and the only kind of really subtle color is given by the color of the kind of travertine that defines the here we lower almost into the lower part of the building, the old library, and we see, and you have to take my word for it, okay, it's broken, and you see kind of basically the layering between the basement, the ground floor, the bridge, and how all these levels kind of interact. And here, kind of looking down from the ground floor past the travertine layer to the ceiling. And of course, that kind of section also kind of represents, to some extent, a section through history. And then we've all been kind of showing some of the kind of environment of the building and some of the kind of outside spaces. This is the heritage garden that is kind of sunken and that accompanies the entrance to the historical part. So this is my presentation, and what I think our greatest ambition in the two cases was to design buildings that were not gross or grotesque or kind of typical star architecture buildings that kind of do all attention to themselves, but buildings that work scrupulously inside conditions that are defined by other architects, that also work well with architects of various generations, and that kind of provide their treasures or their qualities kind of once you're inside, kind of rather than plastering them all over on the outside. Thank you.